Welcome to Service Titans, the podcast where we dive deep into the inspiring journeys of Black men within the AmeriCorps community. From serving in classrooms to rebuilding neighborhoods, these are the stories of passion, purpose, and resilience. Join us as we amplify the voices of members of the AmeriCorps community and share their triumphs, challenges, and the impact they've made in their communities. Whether you're a seasoned AmeriCorps veteran or someone considering service, this is the space to explore, reflect, and be inspired. Get ready to be uplifted, empowered, and connected. This is Service Titans.
The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not reflect the views of their employers, organizations, or any groups they may be affiliated with. We are here to have real, honest conversations, and that means everything shared is coming from personal perspectives, not on behalf of any company or institution. Some episodes may include discussions around sensitive topics that could be triggering or emotionally intense for some listeners. Please take care of yourself and pause if you need to.
Tony, welcome to the podcast. Let's start with your upbringing. Can you share a little bit about being a first-generation college grad from North Philly and how that shaped your journey in life in general?
Yeah, so definitely a proud Philadelphian, go Birds. And regards to just my upbringing, and I think this is something that I've shared with other people in other spaces, but glad to talk about it publicly here. I feel like Philadelphia is kind of one of those cities where, you learn a lot, right? I think you learn a lot about yourself and just I think about a lot about how the world works as well. So definitely being from Philadelphia, growing up kind of blue collar, definitely first gen college grad. My mom actually had me when she was young. And a lot of that has kind of shaped my outlook on life. And by that, what I mean is my mom herself did not graduate from high school. So I kind of grew up with one of those experiences in the type of household where everything was focused on school and academics and learning, right? It was presented to me as kind of like I hate to say it now because I recognize now that like, that's not how the world works. But like education was presented to me as almost like the silver bullet, right? The panacea. Mm-hmm. If you go to school, you'll be able to get out of poverty. You'll be able to do this and do that. And I think for me, the interesting thing is in a lot of ways that has been my story, right? I think that education has actually provided me with a lot of access and exposure to different things that I think I would not have had if not for some of my school experiences. So I think that definitely rings true. But I think the other thing that sticks out about my childhood is that, I was an only child, but I grew up around a lot of relatives. So definitely, even though I was the only child, I was always kind of surrounded by folks and always felt like I was a member of a community and like teams and groups. So like this idea of kind of collectivism or even kind of collective action is something that like, despite being the only child, that's actually the only way I kind of knew the world to work, right? Grow up in an environment where, you might be living in poverty or you may have to overcome, trauma. A lot of times it's the people around you that really support you. And it's really about banding together that lets you overcome those different kind of adversities. So for me, again, I think it's important to note that like my upbringing, just the idea of kind of collectivism, working together in community is something that was ingrained in me from an early age. I grew up in one of those houses where, my grandmother was the matriarch, and everybody pretty much had to fall in line. Definitely, it was one of those things where community was a huge part of it, right? I knew that everyone kind of was a part of the team or a part of the community. I learned early that like when you're on a team that, everyone has a role and, you really have to figure out how to play your role well so that the entire team can function and can prosper. So yeah, I think with my upbringing, I would say the cornerstones are probably community, education, I think, and education both kind of formally as well as informal. I think that a lot of things that I learned about life was not in the classroom, not from teachers. I often share this, I haven't said this in a while, but the reality is that like when I was in school, when I was younger, I was always, I think, a good student, but definitely I was a good student because the people who weren't in school were telling me how to be a good student. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It was a lot of the guys in the neighborhood, I think, who, really impressed upon me like the importance of school and of education and even like being mindful of not taking things for granted. Like I think I also had that experience where, you grow up around some different experiences and you see some things and you begin to recognize that, while life can be, an amazing thing, it's not without its challenges. And I think that I was able to learn how to be resilient, how to persevere, because I was surrounded by a lot of people who, were doing those things. They were persevering. They were displaying resilience in their own special ways.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think that thread of community, but also that common purpose and education being that driving force. It also kind of reminds me a lot of where my family, my granddad was sort of the centering force around value and education. But also, like you talked about that community, those guys in the neighborhood who also just kind of directed you in the right way, and also watching some of those ups and downs help you kind of understand which ways to move. So thanks for just like painting that picture of not only your experience, but also those around you in your community and how they in some intentional ways and unintentional ways kind of helped you be the man that you are today. So I want to kind of pivot, talking a little bit about AmeriCorps. And I know in some ways that's our common bond is like through the AmeriCorps experience. So how did you discover like AmeriCorps, and what were you kind of looking for in that discovery from when you started working with AmeriCorps? Was it more like purpose driven, or just like you talked about, continue to build that community, or was it more just like career building? Like, what was that introduction to AmeriCorps for you, and what drove that?
So it's interesting. Our connection is through City Year, but I actually got into AmeriCorps because of Teach for America. Yeah, I was a TFA core member, and I mean, I think typical to when people my age were doing it, it was kind of like that first job out of college. And I think for me, it was unique in a sense that like I actually did not consider teaching, right? Like I always knew education was important. I always thought about a way for me to be a positive influence on like younger people from my neighborhood, or even people who looked like me. But definitely, I never thought that it would have been through formal education. And I think that Teach for America, at the time that I found the program, was like, it was, for lack of better words, it was almost like a godsend, right? It was allowing me to immediately put to work, all the things that I thought I had learned as an undergraduate at Temple University, but in a way that was meaningful, So definitely Teach for America was my kind of entree into AmeriCorps. And I think with regards to the reasoning behind it, honestly, it was the marketing, right? They had great marketing. It was kind of like, hey, listen, you can. I think the line that got me, it was, they said it was Peace Corps. It was like doing Peace Corps here, right? And I was like, Peace Corps. I know about that program. It's a program that I actually plan to do later in life. I did some research. I know that they have like a whole little thing you can do when you're old. So my plan right now is to be like one of those senior Peace Corps folks. But definitely for me, it was an opportunity for me to immediately kind of, invest in young people, right? To invest in other children who I think may have not had as many opportunities as I had. And I also feel like, it's one of those things where AmeriCorps, and again, I think this was the TFA thing. They had a way of kind of putting some very young, enthusiastic people in schools. And I'll say this now with some humor, but definitely before we really knew life, you know what I'm saying? So like
figuring it out.
We were naive and naive in a good way, because I think that it allowed us to, for me at least, right? I was able to approach every day like, I'm taking over the world today, me over the world. And I think, it had a lot to do with, I think, again, how the program was presented to me, but also my age. But for me, AmeriCorps was, now let's be clear, right? It did provide me with the job. So like it did help spur my career. But I think when I did TFA and I did AmeriCorps, for me, it was really focused on like a sense of obligation, right? It was just a sense of gratitude as well, being intentional, thinking about a lot of the things that I overcame and thinking about my friends, some who did not get the opportunities I got. I was like, well, this is my way to be able to kind of pour back into people the way that I think a lot of people poured into me. So it was definitely connected to career, but it was also one of those things where it was like, I felt empowered to be able to take what I knew and what I could do at the time, and to be able to kind of share those gifts at the time, with the young people that I was surrounded by. I was a 4th and 6th grade teacher at Paterson Public Schools, school number 4. The principal's name was May Bradley. I remember during the interview, when I actually interviewed for that school, I sat down with May Bradley and some others, and I was sitting across from, the term I'll use now was like, elders, right? But I wouldn't have used it then, right? But I realize now when I sat down across from that group of elders and we were having a conversation about teaching and about teaching in a community, I knew that that was where I was supposed to be, right? I knew that I was supposed to be at TFA at the time. I knew I was supposed to be going to school number 4 in Paterson. And I say this, I realize now that I might be saying it because I'm bragging, but the school I taught at was actually the feeder school for Eastside High School, which the movie Lean On Me is based on. That gives you. So for me, being from North Philly, being from like Fifth and Allegheny, formerly known as the Badlands, I felt like I was literally being transplanted right back to, not my community, but to the community that had a lot of similarities where I was, brought up. So it was special. I loved it. It was probably now I think I can say this with a lot of sincerity and authenticity, but I recognize now that like, it's probably the hardest job I've ever had. However, again, to go back to that like youthful enthusiasm and like optimistic, not naivete, right?
Yeah.
I actually didn't even realize how important and how hard of a job it was in a moment, but I flash back on it now and yeah, it was a very important job and it was also hard work. But like I said, I loved every minute of it and definitely being able to just to give, right? To be able to pour into other people is special. I think I learned then, and it's interesting. I think my TFA experience, specifically being at School 6, really made me understand that like everyone has privileges and everyone has assets and resources. And like, no matter your background, that you still have some things going well for you. How do you leverage those things and share those with others? So yeah, I would say AmeriCorps was definitely, a career starter. But for me, it was absolutely about kind of like giving back and investing in the community. And honestly, when I sat across from Principal Bradley at that interview, it was almost like the elders were telling me, hey, listen, we know you have something in you and we think that what you have in you, you need to share with these children. And I really felt inspired and empowered by them to be a part of that community in that way.
No, man, that's so dope. And I think in a lot of ways, it just kind of reminds me. So funny you say that, Tony, because I was going through some old photos and I came across a picture from my AmeriCorps term and the things that it just brought forth, but also that word around like the commitment I felt during that time, but also like the obligation. Like I was very similar, able to serve, somewhat similar to my neighborhood, and like that obligation that was so present during that time, man. So like, thanks for like painting that picture. But I also say this, Tony, like I think as I've evolved as both of a man, but also my just thoughts around what AmeriCorps means, its service, et cetera, I recognize that there's an evolution of like what AmeriCorps means. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that if that's cool with you. So now in soon to be 2026, like how was your perceptions around AmeriCorps evolved in its role in communities? If it has evolved, do you still feel that it has that same role that it may had during that initial term there with TFA?
Oh, that's a really tough question, right? I think I can answer that question on a couple different levels. I think the first thing I'll say is I think the role of AmeriCorps I don't know that it's changed, right? I think if anything, it might even be more critical, right? More necessary. Because I think, for me, what I got from AmeriCorps was you can actually be a part of the solution to the problems you see around you, right? You can be a direct contributor to things that are of importance and that matter to you. And I think that that's still the case with AmeriCorps, right? I think that AmeriCorps still provides people with an opportunity, with an avenue to be able to like actually do work, right? To actually be active towards, addressing some of the problems, whatever they think it is, right? Whether it's environmental issues, whether you want to make sure kids have, solid after school programs. Like I think that AmeriCorps really positions people to be able to step into these roles and actually work on the things that they're interested in. I think the thing that sticks out to me though, and I would kind of highlight as a shift is, I think when I did AmeriCorps, obviously with inflation and with the way things go, things were cheaper. The dollar went further. So I think, what might be different now is I think that AmeriCorps might be in one of those spaces where, I think I would probably not say it's the same as, but I might compare it to, an unpaid internship, right? And I say that to say that I think that like unpaid internships, and if you know about this, a lot of places have them. And these are usually at organizations where people would love to get jobs. And sometimes they actually have a way in through these unpaid internships. But I think folks who are able to actually take advantage of these unpaid internships have a certain background, they have certain resources available to them that allows them to work for free. And while, AmeriCorps doesn't ask you to work for free, I do think that, some of the pay, right? The way that folks are compensated for some of their AmeriCorps work, I think that to me might be an area where it might need to be re-examined, right? I think that
And you're damn near working for free, huh?
yeah. Listen, to go back to my upbringing, right? Like when you
Right.
first gen college grad and people are telling you that, education's the way out of poverty, you're thinking lawyer, doctor, right? And, this education is going to help me get paid to take care of my family. And I think that, AmeriCorps is not going to make you rich, right? But I think at the same time, right, being able to make sure that AmeriCorps is able to allow folks to get a wage, right, a salary that's like livable is important, right? So I think for me, when you think about AmeriCorps, I think that really thinking about ways to increase in diversity, and by that I mean if you want to give back to your community, if you're committed to doing it in this country, then I think everyone should be looking at AmeriCorps programs because I feel like it's one of the most direct ways to do that. My concern, though, is, school is expensive, right? Life is expensive. Living is expensive. And then when you start adding in other factors, maybe how you identify, maybe your race and your gender, those things come into play as well. So I think for me, right, I took a gamble, I think, in terms of, AmeriCorps. I knew what the pay was going to be. And to be honest, it was like, it was good work. This is my first real job. I'm okay with it.
Mm.
I'm not sure that, people today are able to kind of enter AmeriCorps with, the same amount of like enthusiasm and concern, right? Like I would be concerned right now if I was considering an AmeriCorps opportunity. 'Cause I'd be thinking about, can I pay for my lifestyle, right? Can I pay rent and can I pay back my student loans or can I pay back X, Y, and Z? So, again, with regards to AmeriCorps, I think it's necessary. I think it's important. I think it's a great way to empower a lot of people to be able to invest and give back to this country. But definitely, it's a program where I think it might be one where not everyone can participate because they might have their own barriers and challenges. And I think that that's the thing that concerns me about AmeriCorps is like, is it structured in a way where everybody who can give is able to actually give without, without sacrificing their own livelihood or self-worth or whatever, matters to them.
Yeah, that barrier to service and the somewhat unintentional barrier, maybe some would say intentional barrier to allow create avenues for young people to serve. And like you mentioned, we're all coming from different positions in life that makes that decision even harder to make. Outside of the monetary piece, and I know, Tony, you do a lot of work in researching around digital platforms and how it affects young people. And now as a father myself, I know like we're in a world now where clout and trolling like seems to like drive so much of society in so many different ways. When you talk about, and I know you mentioned marketing elevated TFA as an experience for you. Are there some things you think like we can do, particularly from rooted in some of your research, to just like better elevate the spaces for community engagement, service-minded programs? I know there's the monetary piece we talked about in that barrier, but some of it is just lack of understanding of having access or knowledge of these type of opportunities. Like anything you can say to that, particularly from the digital space that we see so many of our young people so much activated in.
Okay. So, I think before even getting into the digital, I can share that like a couple values of mine, or even the way I've always approached life is like exposure and access kind of being critical, I don't know, touch points, almost necessary values or ways to approach life. So I think the first thing is like with AmeriCorps, just making sure that folks are aware of it, right? How are people exposed to it? Do people have access? Are they aware of the program? And I think to tie it into social media, listen, social media is how information is shared. Social media is where conversations are being had. And then, there's also, and I'm going to try not to get too deep into like research, but like there's also research out there that shows that, social media is essentially the new neighborhood, right? Like, digital neighborhoods. There's a scholar, Robin Stevens, who talks about digital neighborhoods being crucial and critical third spaces and third places because this is where, people are hanging out, right? This is where kids are spending their time, right? This is where the youth are. They are online. Research from Pew Charitable Trust that says that, about 50% of the kids in this country are online almost all the time. So when you think about that, it's like if adults, if social service organizations, if City Air, if Teach for America is not existing online in these digital spaces, it's almost a missed opportunity. And not because it's a cool thing to do, or not because going viral is like, the topic and the thing to do, but the reality is that's where the youth are. They are online almost all the time. So to go back to my thoughts around exposure and access, that means that we need to be exposing them to these things online. We need to make sure that they can access these things through online mechanisms, right? Through social media. Like, it's a no-brainer, but at the same time, you're right, it's also necessary. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're trying to get in front of an audience, right? If you're trying to communicate something, you have to go meet the people where they are. And for us, in these days and times, it's social media. It's in these digital neighborhoods.
I think that's so true, is that the reality of it is that's where so many of our young people are spending their time. And I think we'll be naive to not think that that is where this adage to meet people where they are. And I think that it's pretty clear that the social media space and the digital space is where we have to meet our young people. But, Tony, not to go too far in depth into some of the research. I know there's so much research now that's starting to emerge about some of the harmful benefits around like social media, and particularly when we talk about Black youth. Is there anything that you can sort of speak to that? And particularly in some ways, how has your early AmeriCorps experience in some ways, if it did, kind of help you in this kind of space that you're in now, just understanding like some of the longer term impacts of some of the things that we both see in our education system, but also we see in the social media platforms?
So yeah, I think so. What I can share is, I think my experiences personally, as well as kind of AmeriCorps, and that's both through Teach for America, being a teacher directly, but also with City Air, working in New York City and like having teams in New York City public schools. The connection might be really thinking about how folks who are exposed to trauma or who have trauma experiences, how are they developing proactive, positive ways, right? Adaptive ways to cope. And I think that a lot of that is connected, right? I think that thinking about how we are guiding and how we're providing outlets that are positive and healthy for people is really connected to some of this work.
Thanks for sharing that, like particularly like that connected piece there, and understanding like the guidance that's sort of associated with that. And I think it helps me segue into, I just kind of think I shared with you offline, like I've really been into this idea around like legacy, and both not only for me personally, but also the work that we do in this service space. So when you think about, your legacy, Tony, like what is the impact that you leave along this journey as you continue to evolve and continue to understand more in depth of like what this work means, not only to you, but also to our people and young people in general?
That's interesting. I think where I'm at right now, really thinking about, I'm obsessed with this concept. So a couple of things. My favorite book is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And I think the things that I have kind of thought about through my life, my childhood, really kind of all go back to like this concept of invisible men, right? I think about Black men specifically, and that can include Black boys as well, right? But I think for me, when I think about the legacy, a lot of the things I think about are really about how do I make sure that Black boys and men are not invisible, right? How can I make sure that Black boys and men have spaces or opportunities or language or even just words to be able to express and to explain their experiences in a way that allows people to understand the group better? Because I think definitely for me, a lot of it is about, unfortunately, right, trying to kind of counteract and counterbalance some of the negative images, some of the stereotypes, some of those bad stories that, seems to be pervasive when it comes to Black men and boys. And really thinking about it with my research specifically, right? Like I recognize now that like, I had to talk with myself and I had to accept that, all right, I'm a researcher and I'm a writer. And it's like, all right, my writing, essentially, a lot of it is about, how am I showing the world, Black boys who might be other scholars as well, like how am I showing everyone essentially what the lived experiences are like for Black boys and men, and how can everyone learn about these experiences about Black boys and men? And I think to go a step further is like, what are we learning? How can we categorize it? How can we present it to make sure that the information is not only being cataloged, but is also being used and disseminated in a way that like is actually helpful? I say I'm a researcher and a writer reluctantly because like, I definitely don't want to be one of those folks who, does these like amazing research projects and all this writing and they just sit in books or in like university libraries, so really thinking intentionally about like, how am I asking questions that matter, right? How am I conducting research that, someone would want to post on social media to make sure the word gets out there? Like one of the things that I think a lot about with regards to my research, there are several topics, but like really thinking about, the relationships between, how people are moving online and how that impacts what's actually going on in real life in communities, definitely being able to do some important research around how social media use, how people use it differently if they may have been a victim of gun violence. How can community violence interrupters, how can they use social media in a way that helps reduce instances of gun violence? Even thinking about content creators, I was fortunate to be a part of a session a couple of weeks ago through my research lab, the SAFE lab that's led by my advisor, Dr. Desmond Patton, where we pulled together content creators and we're talking about how can content creators leverage their spaces? How can they leverage their networks and their skills to really be a part of this solution to community violence, to gun violence? So those are the things that I think about, right? It's like, go back to what you asked earlier. How am I making the most of what I know about, social media to actually address some of the issues that I care about?
That's incredible. Now, I think it also started this, in some ways, this conversation about just exposure, in a lot of ways, shining a light in a way that combats some of the unnecessary norms or stereotypes that we hear, particularly when you're talking about the Black men and Black boys, which I think is a lot of the essence of this podcast, is having an opportunity to expose and shine a light on some of the incredible things that we do as men, but also things that take place in this AmeriCorps community, which gives me a great way to segue to closing out our conversation, where we have a segment where we ask our guests to shine a light on a service titan in their life. This is a chance to shine a light on someone who's made a small impact on you, or someone made a big impact. And I think I told you offline, Tony, like it was nothing greater for me for somebody in my neighborhood to say, "Hey, I see you, Anton." Just put a little battery in my back to keep going. So I want to give you that opportunity, Tony. Like if there are a service titan, one or two in your life that you want to take a moment to recognize and just kind of appreciate them and let them know that you see them.
Yeah, definitely. I think, there are some folks that jump out immediately. So I think I had an opportunity to work for the Gun Violence Intervention Coordination Center in Philadelphia. That's basically a consortium, a network that was supporting gun violence work in Philadelphia. However, when I was there, my leader, my immediate supervisor, my mentor, and I think just one of the most amazing people I've ever known was Estelle Richmond. She was someone who provided me with a lot of perspective on what it means to be a person of service. And I think there are a couple of things that she said to me, right? But she had a couple of ways of doing work. And I think the first thing that sticks out to me is, so her slogan was, I think it was ready, fire, and then aim, right? And her thing was, don't think so much that it prevents you from getting to action. So I think like her perspective and her outlook on like service really being action oriented was something that she instilled in me and that I learned from her. And again, she's one of those folks who like, if you ever meet her, she's got great stories, but definitely she's someone who was able to tell me stories about growing up just in different parts of the country and like, so many adversities that Black people had to face. And, when you grow up in a certain way, you kind of, I guess you're almost shaped or formed into someone who cares about action, right? Who cares about solving the problem? Because, if you've got, honestly, if you're growing up pre-civil rights, I think you can feel, right? You can see, the urgency of like acting on issues of that importance. And I think that's what she instilled in me. It's funny to say it because it sounds funny, which is why I stumbled on it earlier, but definitely, Estelle Richmond and Ready, Fire, Aim, like that was my big takeaway, right? If you are really into service for and about other people, you need to act. You got to be active. There's no time to sit back and like talk about the problems forever. At some point, you got to put that plan into action. And the plan doesn't have to be perfect. You can always modify, you can change direction, you can pivot, but definitely be action oriented first. Another person that sticks out is a professor that I followed for several years, who I recently had an opportunity to take a course with, Dr. Howard Stevenson, who focuses a lot on kind of racial fluency, racial literacy, specifically with Black boys. And I think that, he's someone else who I think kind of, embodies a lot of the same things, right? But I think it might even be closer to kind of like where I am now, where it's this, let's just say, for lack of better words, right? Convergence, right? This marriage of like research and action, right? He's someone who has been intentional about conducting, publishing and doing all the things that, a scholar would do with research. But his research is action oriented. He has research that actually creates programs and interventions where he works with youth directly to help them figure out everything from how to overcome trauma to how to talk about their racialized experiences to even how to process some of those experiences. So I think, he's another person that really sticks out as being someone who I would say like really is I don't know, I guess is like a service kind of mentor or advisor. And then I think my current advisor right now, Dr. Desmond Patton, I think, he's probably, I would say he is the example of someone who is doing it, I think, differently, but at the same time still is that like very, very meaningful kind of convergence of like research and action. What makes him unique is that I think, and I hope if he hears this, I hope he doesn't object. The way I describe him to me, because I think his background is really rooted in social work. There's something about social work and that outlook, that perspective on working with others where like he approaches almost everything from like this like strengths-based, how can we help support and contribute to like the great things that are already there, that's already happening. So I think, I would probably say he's the person that probably rounds it out for me, right? It's like clearly like ready, fire, aim, get to action, right? And then it's Dr. Stevens, where it's like, hey, listen, you have to know what you're doing and got to know what happened first before you can, really be meaningful and like do something powerful and really create these meaningful interventions. And I think for Dr. Patton, and a lot of his research really focuses on, again, social media and AI ethics. For him, and what I've taken from him and his experience and his guidance is how am I leveraging what's happening, what's hot, what's important right now, right? Like when I talked earlier about like the digital neighborhoods and I referenced Robin Stevens' work, he's the person who keeps impressing upon me, hey, Tony, you've got to think about this differently, right? It's not just these social media spaces. He's the one who helped me understand it is a digital neighborhood, right? And I think for me, trying to combine all those things is kind of how I think about my work. So I would say that those are the three people who really stick out when I think about kind of service mentors or models, right? All people who were service oriented, kind of investing their talents, their intellect, their resources, their privileges into other people. I would say those are the three folks that probably stick out the most.
Thanks for sharing that. And it definitely sounds like you have a dope community, but also a group that don't mind challenging you a little bit when needed to be. So shout out to those service titans for sure. Tony, before we conclude the conversation, I definitely want to give you an opportunity to highlight anything that you would like to share with our listeners, like perhaps any social media handles, upcoming projects that you're kind of working on, or just think like you think people should be tapped in on in general, just in case stay connected to your work. So I just want to give you this space, to share with our audience anything you didn't need to tap in with.
What can I share? Well, I think I'll probably share a few things on LinkedIn, definitely with regards to like things that I'm working on and writing, and I'll probably make those available there. So definitely, if folks want to follow me on LinkedIn, Anthony Shaw, that definitely makes sense. I definitely have social media handles and accounts. I'm probably not as active on them as I should be, but definitely, I think LinkedIn right now is probably the best space because I think LinkedIn is probably where I'll be able to share some of the writing and some of the research that I'm doing on a lot of topics that are important to me, right? But I think I can share, just basically right now, like my research agenda, a lot of it is really focused on investigating how Black men and boys experience harm and loss and basically how they're coping with it, right? And I think a lot of my writing and my research will be in that lane. So definitely if you are a Black man or a Black boy, or if you know and love a Black man or a Black boy, or you just want to learn more about us, I would say definitely kind of look at my LinkedIn account, and I'll either be highlighting my work or I'll be highlighting the work of other scholars who are doing things in this vein. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say there.
Tony, man, again, truly thank you for joining us today, sharing your insights, your experiences. Listeners, be sure to connect with Tony on LinkedIn, as he mentioned. And with that, until next time, keep the conversation flowing, keep service front and center, and continue shining bright in your communities. This is Service Titans. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us as we explored the inspiring journeys of Black men in AmeriCorps. Keep the conversation going by connecting with us on social media. Until next time, stay committed, stay courageous, and keep striving to make a difference. This is Service Titans, where every story told is a testament to the power of service. Thank you for listening.